Good morning. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Thank you so much for joining this press call. I'm Dr. Leah Austin, Director of the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm a co-author of the Early Childhood Workforce Index, along with Dr. Caitlin McLean, Anna Powell, and other center of the staff. A few basics about today's call. We'll be using the Q&A box to field your questions. So please enter your name, your affiliation or outlet, and question at any time. We'll answer questions around 10 a.m. There's really so much to say about early care and education. The system has always been fragile, even before COVID-19 brought it to its knees. But in short, the system is underfunded and broken. There is not enough childcare available for families. The cost to deliver services are more than what most families can afford. And the people who provide early care and education services have long subsidized the cost by the poverty level wages that are paid to them, leaving too many to worry about feeding their own families or being able to pay for housing. In addition, many are working without adequate health coverage or sick leave. Yet the pandemic's crisis also brought relief in the form of ARPA, the historic federal investment in early care and education. In state after state, we saw initiatives that provided direct support to home-based providers, childcare center owners, teachers, and teaching assistants. The last ARPA childcare funding expired less than 2 weeks ago, and now the majority of states have not continued that investment. We're at risk of losing the progress that we've made. Today, our briefing features a family childcare provider and a childcare center provider. They will address how public investment has been a lifeline and what's needed now. The report's lead author will discuss how recent federal and state investments have led to more support for the workforce than ever before. They'll also look at the crossroads we face with the end of federal pandemic relief and a new administration on the horizon, and the support that early educators still need. Allow me to introduce to you today Corrine Hendrickson. She's owner and educator of Corrine's Little Explorers Family Childcare and a founding member of Wisconsin Early Childhood Action Needed. Dr. Caitlin.
Thank you.
Oh.
Sorry. Hi.
Hi, thank you, Corrine. Dr. Caitlin McLean, Index lead author and the Director of Multistate Programs for the Center at the Center for the Study of Childcare Employment.
Hello.
Dr. Yohana Quiróz, Chief Operations Officer at Felton Institute, and also a founder of Unidos for Early Care and Education.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
And co-author and Senior Research and Policy Associate Anna Powell is also on with us today to participate in the Q&A.
Glad to be here. Good morning.
After their brief remarks, we'll take questions again around 10 a.m. And just a reminder, you can enter your question along with your name and affiliation in the Q&A box at any time. And now please welcome Corrine Hendrickson.
Hello. Good morning. So I'm Corrine Hendrickson, and I am a family child care provider in New Glarus, Wisconsin. And since opening in 2007, ARPA was the first funding I had ever received that would directly add revenue. I was able to hire a substitute so that I could pursue a master's certificate in infant early childhood family mental health, go to appointments, and advocate for early educators without having to close my program on those days. I also increased my wage from around $8 an hour to $12 an hour. For the first time in our lives, we weren't having to micromanage our finances. We could buy our growing clothes when they needed them, eat healthier food, and not worry about how we would pay our bills on a monthly basis. I was also able to keep my tuition flat and use the other available small business ARPA funding to not charge families when they were exposed or I had to close due to COVID illness or exposure. I also made much needed repairs and improvements to my program. I closed for the first 10 weeks of COVID in March to June of 2020 and was also able to not charge families during that time. During COVID, the USDA food program had only the tier 1 rate, which completely covered the cost of food served to the children. And I can honestly say, without the ARPA funding, I would have closed and never reopened. Because as a family childcare, if I go bankrupt, I lose my home. I would have needed a higher paying, steady income in order to avoid going into deep debt, especially at my age when I should be planning for my retirement. Once the federal support started to expire, I raised my rates $25 a week per child in June of 2023. And when the USDA Tier 1 only rate expired, I raised my rates an additional $15 a week in August of 2023. But as you all know, the cost of living, not to mention running a business, continues to climb. This summer, I raised my rates an additional $35 a child per week to offset the increased cost to liability insurance, property taxes, food, and more. Now, my weekly tuition is $70 more than it was a year ago, and that has consequences. For the first time in my 17 years of business, when I had 3 open fall spots, I was still trying to fill them the week prior to them being available on September 1st. Several families reached out, but only 2 toured. The rest said I was too expensive and they couldn't justify the cost. In the end, I filled them, but only because the families needed immediate care as they were losing their current care. So in the end, families are paying more, yes, but what am I earning? Still $12 an hour once I count for everything. Furthermore, Wisconsin refuses to invest any state money into childcare, relying solely on the federal block grant. Meanwhile, we have tens of thousands of children without access to care. Their parents are forced out of the workforce and keep our employers without the workforce that they need for our communities to thrive. And this is a choice our state elected officials are making. It doesn't have to be this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Corrine. Good morning, everyone. I've been an author of the Early Childhood Workforce Index since 2016, the very first edition. The index is the first and most comprehensive analysis of workforce conditions and the policies that drive them across all 50 states. I'm proud to be part of it because the index moves us from simply recognizing that something has to be done to how to create policy reform. This 4th edition includes new analyses as well as updated policy recommendations. Highlights include a national data snapshot of the early childhood workforce, how states used federal relief funding, pay and poverty rates for early educators compared with K-8 teachers in every state, and, very important, policy recommendations on what states can do to support this workforce. So what did we find in this edition? Working in early care and education continues to be one of the lowest paid jobs in the nation. Nationally, on average, early childhood educators are paid just $13.07 an hour. Let that sink in a moment. Our childcare workforce, the majority of whom have some higher education, are building our children's brains in the most critical period of their development. And they earn an average of $13.07 an hour. Early educators are paid so little that many worry about where their next meal will come from. And as difficult as it is for anyone to be an early educator in America, conditions are even more harmful for Black and Latina educators who earn thousands of dollars less than their peers. But there are some bright spots too. We also looked at public investment in the workforce. The index tracks how important and impactful federal American Rescue Plan Act spending was. States like Mississippi and Utah created first ever programs that provided direct support to educators in their states. They showed that it could be done. But they're struggling now as one-time federal investments have expired. Other states used ARPA as a springboard to try new programs that were so successful in stabilizing the workforce that they decided to keep them going with their own state funds, even without federal dollars. We'll discuss some of these examples later in the call. But it's important to remember that yes, the federal dollars were important, and the states have so much power and choice to invest in the workforce too. I'll pass this now to Dr. Yohana Quiróz.
Good morning. Felton runs multiple center-based programs in San Francisco, serving almost 400 children and families, and a workforce of about 100 educators. The American Rescue Plan Act funding was a lifeline for our work during the pandemic. It allowed us to continue providing essential ECE services to families navigating immense uncertainty, illness, and trauma. This funding also supported our workforce of about 100 educators, primarily Black and Latinas, many with over 10 years of experience and college degrees. These women, who are the backbone of ECE, have historically been underpaid and undervalued, despite their critical role in supporting our community. Let me share the story of one of our educators, Maria, a dedicated teacher who has been with Felton for over 18 years. During the pandemic, Maria faced incredible challenges. Like many of our staff, she was worried about the health risks and continuing to work during the pandemic, while also balancing the stress of caring for herself and her own family. The ARPA funding helped us to provide Maria with an additional $100 a day of hazard pay, personal protective equipment, ensuring that her essential work was valued and compensated fairly during these difficult times. In addition to the financial support and PPE supplies, we offered mental health and wellness services, which Maria accessed to manage the emotional toll of working through the pandemic. She expressed to us how critical these supports were in helping her stay resilient for children under our care and for her own family. Maria's story is one of many that shows how ARPA funding not only kept our doors open, but also kept our educators strong and supported during a time of immense personal and professional strain. Without this support, many like Maria would have struggled to continue working, and we would not have been able to keep our programs running during the time to serve children and families who really depended on this service to go to work. When federal support like ARPA ends, local governments can make a difference, and San Francisco has demonstrated this through initiatives like Baby Prop C. This local measure has provided essential funding for our ECE program, helping to increase teacher compensation, improve the working conditions, and address the shortage of affordable childcare in the city by providing additional funding to support these services. And while local investments like Baby Prop C have been a critical support, they are not a sustainable solution on their own. Local governments simply do not have the resources to carry the full burden of funding essential services like ECE. The high cost of providing quality care, particularly in a very high-cost city like San Francisco, requires consistent long-term investments that local funding alone cannot maintain. Now, without ARPA funding, we face challenges. As a large ECE center-based provider, Felton Institute relies heavily on public funds at the local, state, and federal levels. Without continued support, we can't meet the growing demand or maintain the same level of quality care. Many programs across the nation are closing, putting additional strain on an already impacted system. This will hurt our families who rely on our services to work and contribute to our economy, and for our workforce, primarily women of color who remain underpaid despite their essential role. This situation is unsustainable for them, for our programs, and for our community. This is why continued government investment at all levels is crucial. ECE is not just a local issue, it's a national priority. Local governments like San Francisco have stepped up when needed, but they cannot do it alone. If we want every child to thrive in a universal childcare system, we need long-term federal investment to support families, educators, and programs like Felton's. We must and can do better. I urge policymakers to recognize that while local initiatives like San Francisco Baby Prop C are important, they cannot fully replace the role of the federal support. The future of ECE depends on a sustained and equitable investment from the federal government. By continuing to support this critical sector, we can ensure that each and every child, especially those furthest from opportunity, have the foundation to succeed. I'll pass it back to Kathleen.
Thank you, Yohana. Ready for some good news? We can fix this. Early educators' poor working conditions are not inevitable, but a product of policy choices. In the last few years, we've seen more support for the workforce than ever before. And we can build on that with 3 policy priorities. First, invest in direct public funding to early care and education programs to provide early educators with a living wage, healthcare, and safe and supportive work environments. Next, prioritize compensation standards and a wage floor across all settings so that no one working in early care and education earns less than a regionally assessed living wage. Create a salary scale that sets minimum standards for pay, accounting for job role, experience, and education. Finally, adopt system-level workplace standards, such as guidance on appropriate levels of paid time off for vacation and sick leave, paid planning and professional development time, mental health, and teaching supports. The last few years have shown us the importance of federal and state investment in early care and education. Now, federal, state, and local leaders need to step up. New Mexico and Washington, D.C. are well known for their efforts to invest state and local money in early care and education. But fewer people know about Minnesota and Illinois. Both states offer clear examples of how federal dollars spurred state leaders to pioneer new programs for workforce compensation. And neither of these states are giving up. Their programs have been so successful, they've decided to continue to invest state money in supporting early educators. And support can also take place at the local level, like San Francisco, which Yohana mentioned. Bottom line, this is a critical time for national, state, and local leaders to step up, not back, for these skilled educators whose support is so crucial for children, families, and the economy. Thank you. We'll take your questions now. I'll hand it over to Penelope Whitney to facilitate.
All right, great. Let's see. So welcome, Daisy and Emily. I don't know if you had a chance to add any questions to the Q&A, but if you haven't yet, and you do have questions, just come off your mic and let us answer.
I don't see a way to, I don't see a written Q&A, so I'll just ask. So with your findings for the wages, I'm curious if there are any, if it's worth explaining sort of how you arrived at that. I mean, there was so much money infused in the field over the last few years, and some wages were temporarily supplemented, or some programs gave bonuses for certain periods of time. Then there was also the counter effects of inflation. I'm just hoping maybe you can talk through if you controlled for any factors, or what year you were pulling those wages from, just so I can better understand how you got there.
Caitlin, do you want to start with that? And then we might want to pass it over to Anna.
Yeah, I just want to make sure you have seen the data that we provided on the change in recent years. So we looked at the change between 2019 and 2022 and found that early educators' wages rose by 4.6% nationally after adjusting for inflation, which, as you mentioned, was pretty high in the later years there. So there was some improvement. But this is less than inflation-adjusted wage growth for the US workforce as a whole, which was 4.9%, as well as for fast food workers, which was 5.2%, and retail workers at 6.8%. So I just want to make sure that you have that context. And then Anna, if you'd like to add anything more specific about the methodology or anything else, please feel free to weigh in.
Certainly. So in the index, we have been using for this edition, the American Community Survey, specifically the 2022 5-year sample. Caitlin, Dr. McLean just spoke to the wage change, which covers actually a 6-year period. But in terms of our estimate of the prevailing wages nationally, that would be looking across those 5 years. So certainly it does contain some pre-pandemic years, because otherwise, if we used a more recent data set, we would not be able to provide state level wages in most of the country because the populations in the sample would be too small. I hope that helps answer, and I'm happy to clarify further.
No, that's helpful. And I did see that change from 2019 to 2022 that Caitlin was talking about. So I remember from the last workforce index that, you know, early educators were in the bottom 2% of, I think, all occupations nationally. I think maybe either right above or right below dog walkers. So I see that that hasn't really changed either. So our understanding, and obviously this supports what Caitlin was saying about the overall workforce increasing by 4.9%, but we just haven't really seen anything move the needle so that this workforce has leapt up at all.
Yeah, I can jump in to speak more to that, Emily. So I think, you know, it's a couple of things. One is, yes, you're right. We did see a little bit of an improvement, right? That's 4.6%, even after adjusting for inflation, which, you know, we don't know exactly the role that historic inflation has played there, but you have to assume that if there hadn't been this investment, that I just don't see how we could have seen any improvement at all once adjusting for inflation. The other thing is, you know, the report shows varied changes in wages by different states, and we don't fully know why some states saw more increases than others. But it's interesting that in places like Utah, where they very directly and explicitly encouraged early care and education programs to increase wages themselves, we did see a substantial increase in wages. In many states, it was either left up to the program to decide how they would use the funds, or in some cases, they were very explicit about you know, providing sort of extra income through bonuses or stipends. And these are things that wouldn't necessarily show up in wages because it's non-wage income. So I appreciate the question. It's a little bit of a complex situation, but I think it's a combination of, yes, there has been some improvement, and also some of the investments didn't go into wages. They went into this sort of non-wage income, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
I wanted, hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you great. Thanks,
Hi,
Daisy.
great. I wanted to follow up with that because, yeah, there was lots of talk about the stipends, you know, after the pandemic as a way to retain workers. Could you explain a little bit how, because they weren't considered, they were non-wage income, did they play a role at all in at least retaining the workforce?
Yeah, I can jump in. One thing I'll just clarify is it really depends on the state and the program. As you know, everything's complex in early care and education. So in some cases, they may have given bonuses through their employer, and then it would count in their wages. But in other cases, it went direct to the educator. They would have to apply, and then they would receive you know, a separate check that would be counted as income, but not wages. So just to make that clear. And then our report didn't directly analyze turnover rates in response to these various initiatives and investments, but over the years, various other organizations have looked at the effect on retention from stipend programs. So for example, North Carolina's wages program, they have consistently shown that it has improved retention for educators in North Carolina. It's one of the main reasons that they have been able to continue to fund the program over many years. So you know, there's more research to be done on that, but what we've seen so far is that these various types of wage and non-wage improvements in educators' financial security does help them stay in the field longer.
Is that good? Daisy, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, no, thank you. That answered my questions. Thanks.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah. I actually had a question I wanted to ask Corrine. Corrine, there's been so much talk about, the different presidential candidates, and it's hard to really know what's on the horizon. We're definitely at a crossroads. And are there any policies that you would like to see implemented in the new administration?
So yes, with that, I think looking at what was left on the table. So the American Families Plan with paid family medical leave would be extremely helpful. Getting the last 10 states that haven't taken the ACA expansion would be helpful. Wisconsin is one of them. And many of our child care providers, we lose our employees at 27 because they're no longer on their parents' health insurance. But that paid family medical leave also would help both the parents when they have a new infant, have that relationship with their children and really bond with them and not have the stress of having to go back to work far too early. And then also alleviate some of the stress on the infant toddler shortage, because if those children aren't coming for longer, they're in that stage in that lower ratio for a much shorter period of time. Secondly, those of us in the field, most of us don't qualify for paid FMLA under the current laws because our employers don't have 50 employees. And it's also unpaid. And so when we have a baby, or this career is hard on our bodies, we frequently have knee problems, hip problems, shoulder problems, wrist problems because of all the bending and the labor intensiveness of this field. So I know several family childcare providers who have had to close in their 50s because they go on disability because they can no longer do their job. And that is a huge problem. Or they will work until their knee problem becomes a hip problem, and now they need to be out for 20 some weeks. So if we had paid FMLA, that would allow us to take care of ourselves and get the surgeries we need immediately, improving our health and well-being and the ability to care for the kids, but then also allow the parents, like during COVID, to take that time for themselves to care for their children so that they can come back to that program instead of us worrying about closing for 12 weeks while we recover. And then the parents have gone elsewhere because they couldn't take off of work that long as well.
Thanks
I have
for hearing that.
Sorry, I have a follow-up question for Corrine, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned about retirement, so I don't mean to get too personal, but could you tell me how old you are?
Yeah, I'm 45.
Okay.
And then
thanks.
that's another piece. California was just able to get into the state retirement system. Most of us don't have retirement. I was sharing with the group last week, I have $6,000 in my retirement for myself, besides my Social Security. It's not going to work. And there are a lot of us in the field that can't retire because we don't have the funds to do so. And as a sole proprietor, and as low as our profit is, as low as we make, our Social Security is abysmal. And so that's another piece. We really don't have a way to retire. Our median age in Wisconsin is 54 for family childcare. We have so many in their 70s and 80s.
Corrine, you just broke up. I think you're saying you have many providers that are much older. Can you say that again? Oh, you're breaking up again. I know that she said a few days ago that they have many providers in their 70s and 80s who just simply can't retire. They're still working.
Yep. So in their 70s and 80s, we have median age is 54. So we have several, and then very few are getting into this field is the other piece.
So yeah, I know that just the timing of this report, I know this is something you do on a regular basis, so I get it, but we're also a month away from the elections. And as you know, there's just been so much talk among all the candidates about the cost of childcare for families. There's been a lot of focus on how to lower the cost to help families, but not much being said about the ECE workforce. I was curious, Corrine, given this opportunity, what would you like to say about what kind of change you hope to see with the coming administration that will hopefully improve your quality of life?
So the Harris-Walz campaign has talked about the need to make sure that the wages for the educators are higher, along with lowering the out-of-pocket costs. So I do agree with that, because it doesn't matter how much you lower the out-of-pocket cost to parents. If we're not there, there's no care. And we cannot charge more, especially if you're lowering out-of-pocket costs, because that won't work under a new system. And so really making sure that that other piece is there, and making sure it's done in a way so that whatever legislation policy happens, that there's a requirement for the dollars to go to wages. And I say this for two reasons. One, to make sure we get the money in our pockets as wages for educators, and it doesn't go into the owners of programs. Private equity is a big problem. They are sending out letters on a weekly basis now to provider group center owners throughout Wisconsin wanting to buy them out. And it feels very predatory. And I think part of it is because they know that we're getting desperate. And they're the ones that would be less likely to make sure that the money goes to the wages. So we'd have to make sure whatever legislation is out there that is specific wages, specific retirement, specific benefits, and it's based off of, years of experience, it's based off your education, and it's based off of all those various things, so that it is a career opportunity. Because right now it does not feel like a sustainable career, because it really isn't. Like, we're making bottom 2% of all wages. And so I really feel like whatever the new administration, whichever wins, that needs to be something that's looked at and very carefully implemented to make sure that the unintended impact isn't that we continue to be, that we, the educators, don't continue to be underpaid and overworked, but that we truly are getting the wages that we deserve, especially if there's government money coming in. If that made sense.
One thing I wanted to clarify, Caitlin, can you speak to the bottom 2% versus 3% and what we found this year?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is a methodology issue, and Anna, feel free to jump in too, but we essentially used a different data source with this report purposefully, so that we could include self-employed childcare providers like Corrine, who are included in the census data that we used in this report, but are not included in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that we used in our previous report. So that alone, means we can't really compare between the two. But the other thing is, with this new data source that we use this time, we can actually pool various roles in early care and education to arrive at a number. So when we say early childhood educators earn on average $13.07 an hour, that means we're including folks who might be called childcare workers or preschool teachers. Whereas in the past, when we used that other data source, we couldn't do that. And so we were really talking about childcare workers. So that's also why, because we're sort of including the full range of roles this time around, instead of maintaining that false dichotomy between childcare workers on the one side and preschool teachers on the other.
And so, Caitlin, the number that reporters should be using is they're in the lowest 3% of the workforce, or the lowest 2%. That's what I'm just trying to clarify.
Oh, I see. This report is the lowest 3%.
Okay. Thanks. Any other questions?
Yes. I want to go back to Corrine, if that's okay. At the beginning, you were saying, how you've had to increase your weekly rates. I think you said 3 different times in the last year, which, I think obviously tracks with what I've heard from other providers and is just happening nationally. Can you share what your total weekly rates are now? And you can just pick, if they're stratified by different age groups, maybe just one. And because the families that inquired with you, but then kind of went in a different direction because they said your program was too expensive, could you talk about that? Because I would think that some of your peers or competitors in your area are facing similar challenges and having to raise their rates too. So I just would love if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Did I? Yes, I am muted. I was sorry. I was looking up my rates because I had just changed them, so I don't really know them at the moment. Wisconsin is really low compared to most other states, as an FYI. I, however, am in a rural county, and I am by far the most expensive. So for 6 weeks to 2 years is $281 a week. 2 to 5 year olds is $259 a week. And then when there's no school, so there's like summer breaks and things like that, if I have any that would be 6 and up, are $247.50 a week. One of the things that I have found is a lot of programs in my area and a lot of family childcare aren't raising their rates. Instead, they're taking the hits and going into debt because they're so worried that they won't have any children. So that's frightening, honestly. I know several that are looking at possible bankruptcy right now. And then the other thing is Wisconsin allows up to 3 children without having to be regulated. As more women are getting forced out of the workforce, I am seeing more and more often on, Facebook groups, mothers pages, things like that, more and more people taking on care of other children outside of their own, and they charge significantly less. However, this leaves a lot of health and safety concerns and concerns for those people providing the care, because if they don't have business liability insurance and one of those children gets hurt, they're looking at losing their entire home and everything else that goes with it. So we've been trying in Wisconsin to really help educate people who are watching children unregulated that they still need to do some basic protection for themselves, and to also understand that you're operating a business and you need to pay taxes still, and we don't want you getting into trouble that way on the other end because of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So are you saying that because of the area you live in and it being rural, the alternatives for care often are unlicensed or unregulated childcare arrangements? Is that right?
Yes.
Gotcha. And when you said you raised your wages from $8 to $12 an hour, are you referring to your own take-home pay, or do you have any staff in your program?
So I'm referring to my own. So basically what I look at, because I just do a sole proprietor Schedule C, is what I made in profit last year divided out by the number of hours that I worked based off my time space. So I work 50 hours with children and another 20 to 25 on top of that for the business end and advocating and other things that I do. So it's like a 75-hour work week. As far as my staff, yes, I finally have staff. I never did before COVID. Our state is still was able to reallocate some other ARPA funding and continue our program that helps with wages. So my staff, I pay her $12 an hour for substitute, and then she also still gets a bonus of $125 a month based off of my quality rating indicator system scale. And so she, on average, because I don't use her a whole lot, probably makes around $20 an hour, which is well over what I make.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing all that.
Yep.
And let's see. So Yohana, I'm curious for you, since you work also at a program that provides care to children, how you all have managed over the last year as far as raising your rates or otherwise figuring out ways to make up the loss of ARPA dollars.
Sure. Well, we happen to be in San Francisco, who has implemented this Baby Prop C funding that allows for educators to make at a minimum a $28 an hour, which sort of goes with the live-in rate. And it has been transformational to be able to be part of that system that recognizes and values the educators for the work that they do that is so essential. So we have been fortunate to be able to be in San Francisco, but we know that's not the reality even across California, right? Like educators are still being paid significantly low and across the nation as well, just like Corrine is talking about. And so for us, the ARPA funds really allowed us to address the critical needs during the pandemic and being able to offer not just the compensation supporting our workforce, but also all the other wraparound supports that they needed in order to remain in the field. And the Baby Prop C funds have allowed us to not only recruit educators, we're seeing an increase in interest in this field because they now feel like it's a decent wage, that someone with an entry-level position can make $28 an hour. And also we're seeing a significant retention rate that we have not seen in the past. And having a workforce of 100 educators every year, for example, we would have anywhere from 20 to 30 openings at the beginning of the school year. This year alone, we had like 4 positions open. And that was pretty drastic. We had not seen that in many decades. And this is what the second year that we're moving into the second year of Baby Prop C being implemented. And so we're seeing how these critical investments are not just supporting to recruit people, which it's not, one thing is to recruit, right? But the main thing is to retain these educators because there's so much investment that goes into training, supporting, and sort of getting them settled. And so it's hard to lose them. So we are seeing the benefits of these local investments, but I know that the family childcare providers in San Francisco are also benefiting from these initiatives as well. So center-based and family childcare centers, like basically Baby Prop C is addressing the gap that exists and being able to, and we're fully subsidized, by the way, from the state dollars, right? So the subsidy at the local level allows us to then meet that threshold of compensating people at this baseline of $28 an hour, all the way to like 45 for a lead teacher.
That's incredible.
Yes.
Quick follow-up question for you, Yohana. It's nice to see you here.
Nice to see you, Daisy.
Has it helped you, reopen all your classrooms? Because I know, that was a slight struggle right after 2021.
Yes, we actually, similar to Corrine, we were just closed for March through June. And in June, we brought our entire workforce back slowly but surely. And we reopened all of our classrooms immediately because we knew that families were relying on this critical service to be able to go to work. And so we reopened all of our classrooms and have been fully operational across our 19 classrooms since June 2020. And we have not closed at all. But a lot of that is because of these additional ARPA funds and stipends that were provided to programs, which really allowed us to remain open. Because, if you remember, like we were operating with very low, small class sizes, right? So we weren't able to really account for serving what your typical classroom of 24 preschool kids, right? We were operating at just 12, but because we were being held harmless, right? That allowed us to still serve, keep the same number of staff with 12 kids, which really, we saw so many benefits to that as well in terms of like teacher-child interactions, being able to respond to children's needs, especially during that critical time, and being able to individualize care. But yeah, so it's been good. San Francisco is really leading the country in terms of like the investments that are necessary for a high quality ECE system.
All right. Any other questions before we wrap up? And if you have any follow-up, I can always put you in touch with either Corrine or Yohana, or we also have several other educators who are available to speak to the press.
Melvie, if we have time, I have one more thing I'd like to add.
Yeah, jump in.
Well, I just want to come back to the original question about, I'm getting at this underlying question of, okay, there was all this investment. We saw all this state initiative and state action, but also not much improvement in educators, well-being and financial security. And so it's like, what's going on here, right? How do we explain this? And I just want to make sure that we all keep in mind that, I mean, to Yohana's point, childcare was basically on the brink of destruction when the COVID pandemic hit, because childcare has always been on a shaky foundation. As we all know, parents can't afford to pay what it actually costs to provide high quality care. And so educators are always living, sort of on the brink of poverty and not being able to pay for their retirement, all these things. That was the case before COVID hit. Then COVID hit, and it was incredibly disruptive. And programs were closing, educators were leaving. So we have to keep in mind that the funding was not about making the ideal childcare system. It was about just trying to prevent the utter collapse of the childcare system that we had. And it was successful in that. And it also allowed a lot of states to innovate, experiment with different ways to actually support programs in a more sustainable way, making sure that they actually have upfront funding so that they can pay their staff. But what they didn't do, what that funding didn't provide, was substantial new amounts of money that meant that they could vastly raise educators' pay the way that, for example, the DC Pay Equity Fund has done. That's a very different approach where they have invested substantial amounts of local money with the express goal of improving educators' circumstances, not just stabilizing what we already had.
Thanks, Caitlin. Well, I will wrap things up then. And thanks everyone for joining us today. And we really appreciate hearing from everyone, from Corrine Hendrickson and Yohana Quiróz, Caitlin McLean, and Leah Austin. And the index will be released on this Wednesday, and we're really looking forward to that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.